was in the room. So those are probably the key things to look for, and if they're reported to you, they're things that you probably should be concerned about. I put a few more things down below there, and it's the knocking. Now the knocking is an interesting thing because it's something that I've had happen, and it's something I learned a lesson from. It's knocking on the front door. And if you've had knocking in the house and now suddenly something's knocking on the front door, when you open the door, you have really just unwittingly granted permission for something else to come in to play with what's in the house. And a lot of people, I've had reports of that happening, and I've asked them what happened with the activity after that happened, and they said everything got worse. So, and I can attest to that because I've been a victim of that. So that's something, if you have the above things happening, if you feel like you want to give any advice at all to a client, I would, I'm going to discuss that too with you, what advice you should and shouldn't give. But that's a piece of advice that I don't think would harm them in telling them if they have that happen. Even if it's a rapping on a window, don't open the window. If there's nothing there. Obviously, if there's somebody out there visiting, they probably want to open the door, but it does happen.
Now, does it usually happen in usually groups of three?
Threes. Every 3 raps.
3 raps?
3 raps. Knock, knock, knock.
That was the encouragement if we're trying to get something to make noises and we're going, can you knock 1, 2, 3? Is it encouraging something to come at that point?
That's a good question, and I'm going to talk about my belief on provoking of any kind as part of the ways to protect yourself at investigations. That's an excellent question. I'll answer your question first, though, by saying I would absolutely never do that. But I'll tell you why after.
Okay.
I promise I will.
All right.
So, yeah, knocking, the significance of sets of 3s, and it's not just knocking, it's in anything. You may see someone who truly is injured with scratches, and there'll be 3 scratches. There'll be reports of raps of 3 things, three distinct raps on a wall, on a door, on a window, 3 chairs knocked over. The significance of 3 is that this is the way that a demonic will mock the Holy Trinity. Exactly, and it's actually it's quite frightening when it happens to you. But that's another thing that if you do have reports of, certainly that's something to be concerned about. So how do you tell if it's a human haunting, or maybe it's just something that's fairly insignificant, or if this is something that's building potentially into a demonic infestation? And I put down there human versus inhuman, because a lot of times you'll get reports from the client and then you'll go and they'll be significantly different from what you received in your report, right? Sometimes it'll be a lot less than what they said, and you'll debunk it all. Sometimes you'll go there and you realize that they simply weren't capable of articulating what was happening. A lot of people are very poor at describing what's going on, and you get there and you realize that it's far worse than what they were saying, and they're like, well, it's not really a big deal. But you know it probably is. So the way to tell, really on the surface, is the power of the activity. Human spirits are probably not going to be capable of doing very much more than pushing this pen across the table. But a demonic entity has a lot more energy. And furniture can be moved, it can be lifted off the ground. Human spirits might be able to shove you down. They're probably not going to be capable of injuring you unless they push you off a cliff, which hopefully you're not investigating on the edge of one, but
you ain't even getting close.
I wouldn't recommend it. And also, I put down on there coarse interaction with the living, and the reason I did that is that if there's actually brutal physical contact, in the case of an incubus or a succubus. And I'm going to talk about a case that we did, and I talked about it with you kind of briefly already, New London, Connecticut. This case was really interesting because the client had reported demonic activity taking place in a home that she and her husband were living in. The interesting stuff that they had reported was hot spots. Other investigative teams had been in there and had been assaulted. Black masses flying by them, equipment being knocked over and broken. a lot of things that were in line with what was potentially demonic. So we were pretty intrigued. We went down there and investigated it. The place was very old. It was in very bad shape. They were in the process of renovating. They didn't have a lot of money, so the renovations were, they would start one in one room, the ceiling would be gutted, wires hanging down, then they would stop and they were working in another room. So we were able to debunk a lot of things. Most significantly, and one of my favorite ones to talk about is the white mass in the living room. Well, the house was only about 5 feet off the street, and they were heavy, heavy, heavy smokers. They never smoked in the house, they said, never. But when they went outside to smoke, they were right in front of the house. So I sat in the living room while they were outside smoking, and they had a window fan, which, by the way, the dual unit window fans are EMF generators, like super duper EMF generators. So anyway, that's another little side.
It's in your book, that one.
It probably is, yeah. But as I sat there, they're smoking, and the fan had this white mist curling in and going all over the floor, and they had this TV about the size of that one. And the light from the TV was causing that mist to appear blue and white and ropey, and so, again, it's what you make of your investigation when you go. If it sounds like it's probably explainable, it more than likely is. But the New London case was an interesting one because one thing they failed to mention was that the woman in the home was being sexually molested by one of the spirits in the house. They had reported to us that they felt the sensation of being physically held down in the bed. We attributed that to the hypnagogic state where they were just experiencing sleep paralysis. Because the male was also reporting that as well, waking up suddenly and couldn't move. She was screaming, "I'm being attacked." So while we were there, we decided to have an experiment. We had her go into the bedroom, and I put a camera in there. And we asked her, lay there and see if it will attack you. So she was in there for about 45 minutes when suddenly, in a very weak voice, she started yelling for her husband. She said, "It's happening. Help me. It's happening." So we went into the room, and she was laying on the bed, awake and very rigid. And as soon as we walked in, she said, she goes, "You came in, and it lifted off me, and it left." Interestingly, when I played the tape back, what do you think that I observed on the tape?
Probably a cat or something.
I'll give you a hint. It was an audio portion of the tape that told me exactly what was happening. She was snoring. She fell asleep. So she suddenly, she fell into a very shallow sleep and was startled out of it and began immediately calling for her husband. Hypnopompic. She was still in the sleep paralysis. So interesting what you find when you, but it was very subtle, so I had to increase the volume and I could hear it. So you never know. And that one, we pretty much disproved everything that was going on down there. But nice people. In fact, they've allowed me to use that information in my upcoming book, which is going to be it's fascinating because what was happening down there was mostly psychological. They were led to believe by, I just think by other groups that had come in there that there was significantly more activity than there was. There may have been activity there, but it wasn't demonic. And we didn't witness anything while we were there. So
most of the time when people feel held down, it's pretty much sleep paralysis.
It is. I agree that it is, because I don't think that there's anything out there that's really looking to trap you in your bed. But that's also, and you've probably read that in my book as well, the subject of alien abduction, where people feel that they're being in the process of being abducted because now they're paralyzed and they can't move, and when you wake up you're prone to a hallucinatory state where you see things leaning over you, and that's the intruder syndrome, where it can work either way. It can work as the old hag syndrome, where people will see what they believe to be the spirit of an elderly woman leaning over them, paralyzing them, or an alien that's leaning over them. So the mind is an interesting thing, especially when it's in just being violently taken out of a sleep state. So, and again, that kind of goes down into some of the next portion of the handout there, mistaken evidence. And a lot of people, they don't understand what's going on. They're fearful. They don't do this every weekend like some of us do. They're not crazy about it. They don't study it. So they have no idea what they're experiencing, and it's up to us to go in there and realize, you know, that some of it's explainable, put their mind at ease. Some of it may not be, though. And I included a few things down there. Water hammer is something that we frequently will encounter at old houses, and it's simply the older plumbing will have a pressurization valve in the basement, and if that valve becomes filled with sediment, it doesn't release the pressure from the water flowing through there. So after they use the water, 10, 15 minutes later, the pipes will bang. And that's what water hammer is. And
In Auburn. That's what happened in Auburn.
they'll confuse that with rapping sounds and knocking. And they'll say, no, I was not using the water. I wasn't in there. So it can happen at any time, especially with the older house rather. You know, environmental factors are a big thing, and it's something that, you know, you don't have to really necessarily be in a construction project manager to understand what some of those things are. I think the more that you go into these houses, the more you're able to spot those things readily. And I've been in enough of them. I've seen some where there's been electrical wire wrapped around the copper pipes. So every single sink and everything in the house is acting as an EMF transmitter. We were in a day school, or daycare center rather, in, I can't remember what town it was. It was out by Boston. It was a long time ago. But every single room, all the classrooms, everything, we were getting this phenomenal 7.0, 8.0 EMF everywhere in the room. So we went down in the basement, and Uncle Joe had been hired to come down and rewire it. There was a main box in the basement with, I've never seen so many main lines running off this trunk. There was probably 100 of them. They ran off, and they were all tethered to the copper pipes everywhere. I'm not talking about 120 volt lines, I'm talking the 240. It ran through there, or 220 rather. It was connected to everything in there, and all the sinks, the phone line was wrapped around it as well. And they reported that the phone was staticky. I wonder why.
Yeah.
So, you know, interesting that the children were being subjected to that. And what were the reports? Headaches, apparitions, feeling of unease, something behind me. I'd feel that way too. We were in there for an hour. Shannon Silvio was with us on that investigation. This was way back, 2006, I think. And as soon as we stepped outside, the headaches that we had went away. It was that bad in there. So you never know what you're going to find, and certainly, you know, being a full investigator and checking all of that stuff out is very important to understanding what they might have going on there. So before we go on to preparing for a demonic investigation, there's one other thing I don't have on the handout, and I wanted to make sure I included it for you, and that's cursed objects. Because I actually dealt with one for the first time about 2 years ago. About a year and a half ago, actually. It's interesting that I arrived at that conclusion because of the activity that was going on was demonic in nature. There was no question in my mind that it was demonic. But it was difficult to derive where it was coming from until the father of the victim gave me some information during the investigation that really steered me toward the cursed object. And it came from many years before that, where the family had been given a doll from Spain for the victim's younger sister, who was a toddler at that time. This was probably 20 years ago. She slept with the doll after the first night, woke up the next morning with 3 deep scratches in her face. The doll had no sharp objects on it, nothing that was protruding that would have caused that. She was frightened, she was terrified. The father took the doll and threw it away. That didn't end it. Everything continued for years, and until it finally stopped. When the victim...
It happened to the same girl even though they got rid of the doll?
It happened to everyone in the family. Okay. Not just scratches, but apparitions, feeling of terror, noises, unexplainable sounds, footsteps, things that were just continuing for a long time. And then it just suddenly stopped. But then the client moved out into a home of his own. And after he'd been there for a while, these things all started up again, the same exact things. And while we were doing our investigation, we actually witnessed some of the things he was reporting. We were in the back bedroom, and we could hear footsteps come right down the hallway and stop right in front of the door. It's not a house settling, and when you're standing there listening to it, and this is exactly what he's reporting. Although we did debunk some of the things he was experiencing, that was interesting that, you know, a few of the things that he did report we did see. Here and in the basement we did see some things that were down there. We heard some voices. So, you know, just thinking back to the doll, that the way that that works is someone who is a practitioner of the occult or the black arts can summon a demon to possess an article that might be given to somebody in order to do its bidding. So where the person who, the human who is now the practitioner of this black art, black magic, has now become a devil or higher order archy of a demon by asking a lower order demon to do their bidding, which is extremely unwise, but it's probably not as good for the victim either. And in this case with the doll, we were very confident that that's what happened with that. My advice to you, if you encounter something that you believe to be a cursed object, do not touch it. Don't remove it. Removing it may take the curse off the person. The demon may have already separated itself from that object, and it may remain there and continue to do its bidding. There's an equal opportunity for it to follow you, and now you're the victim, because the curse may just entail whoever is possessing that object at the time. John Zaffis has written a great deal on cursed objects. He's probably the person that if you encounter something like that, you want to give him a call. But I would absolutely recommend not touching it, not moving it, and leaving it right where it is. You're not going to do anybody any good by moving it. You may make matters worse for the victim as well. So I wanted to add that in there for you too, because that's something I've read about for years, but I've never dealt with it until the case that I did. It was in Ashfield, Mass, about a year and a half ago. So again, I mean, you never know. You never know what you're going to find.
Just got the gentleman from Ludlow just called. He started all of a sudden. His parents passed away. They started moving all their stuff into their house, and all of a sudden they got all kinds of weird activity taking place.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that a case you're actively working on right now?
He just was looking for some information, and we told him we'd research what the site history was and everything else.
Okay.
But he says that most everything just started with that. But then he's witnessed a friend of his in front. You know, he saw an apparition of his friend that passed away. I think it was in a car accident.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
No, this was out of Ludlow.
That's
I
interesting.
haven't seen anything on it yet.
Yeah, that's
We're
more.
not processing it for.
Yeah,
invest.
I just told him a few things to do. You know, see if the usual things. See if the clergy might come in. You know, bless your house.
Sure.
You know, ask him if there's anything certain, and that's one more so far has come back to. It happened since he started moving in his parents.
I'm curious about this only because it's fresh in our minds, the case where I guess they have a vial of holy water that they don't want
They don't remove.
They don't want it removed. Now, something like that obviously would not be cursed.
I wouldn't think so.
I wouldn't think so either.
And it's certainly not harming them to leave it there. If it gives them some comfort that is there,
Yeah.
that's,
That's what it was, as a comfort.
Well, I think
Yeah.
years ago, the home that we went to, the grandparents owned the home and were a big collector of antiques. A lot of activity going on at that time, and they kept all the antiques.
Mm-hmm.
The grandparents, the grandmother had the house blessed many times.
Right.
And the priest put holy water in the cabinets, and now the granddaughter has the home, all the antiques are gone, but
The
they're
brother
still,
has them.
yeah, they
At their
still
home.
have
Oh,
some
that's right, the
activity.
brother did
But she doesn't want to touch the holy water,
Yeah,
because she
especially-
thinks in her mind if she gets rid of it, the activity's gonna.
And again, it's whatever gives them comfort or a level of comfort. Certainly let them go with that. That's not harming anything, for sure.
Now, what about antiques, like this home?
That can have a human attachment to it. Things that people cherish so much in life that even after death they couldn't part with it. That's a typical human haunting, an intelligent haunting, where there may be something attached to that. And it may be very possessive of that, to the point where it may maybe a little ornery in protecting it. And we've encountered cases similar to that.
I think you're right about that, though.
There's a car in the driveway that belonged to
The son.
the son that
Died.
was killed, and it was a car that I guess he had been working on
Yeah.
at the home, and it hasn't been, I don't think they moved it since. It's
They
been on
moved
the
it
pro-
out of the garage.
They moved it out of the garage, but it's been
Mhm.
on the property ever since he died.
Wow.
And they claim they've seen the son sitting.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
And that could be grief again, because grief is so overpowering, it will cause you to do many things and confuse them for paranormal. It could also attract paranormal. So you never know. So how do you prepare for a potentially demonic investigation? I think that's what you're trying to really glean from this meeting today. And you know, I kind of wanted to go over the basics of demonology with you. Maybe it was all old information to you. Maybe there were some new things you picked up in there, so I'm hopeful that that was the case. I gave you three basic rules to live by for going on a potentially demonic investigation. Now, a lot of groups out there have a rule, and New England Paranormal had the rule as well, where they won't allow investigator in training to go on what they believe to be a potentially demonic investigation. My response to that is, how do you know any investigation is not potentially demonic? They all are. They all are. So it's not that you shouldn't have your new investigators ever go on these cases, but if they do go on a case and it turns out that there is the potential for demonic activity, my advice is that they probably at that point should depart the investigation very discreetly. It's not that you should stay there either. And I'll kind of go over why. But, I mean, if you encounter things that are demonic, what power and abilities and skills and knowledge level do you have to deal with that? I don't. I recommend if you don't, the best thing you can do is to disengage, obviously with the courtesy of doing, you know, your client as much a service as you can while you're there, and getting help from the people I put on the last page. Because you alone, no matter how powerful your faith in God is, isn't going to give you the power to deal with any of these forces. And the reason why, and I'd like to use this quote, has anyone here read the book The Demonologist?
No, yeah, but there's,
We all
it's
have
on
a
my
list.
list.
Our producer is putting his hand up. Well, The Demonologist was a book written by GERALD DANIEL and Ed Warren. And it's an incredible book, and there's a quote in there I use all the time. That quote is, "Never forget the diabolic forces you challenge are clever, for unlike any mortal, they possess the wisdom and knowledge of the ages." Using that as a credo going forward in any case you do that's potentially demonic will serve you well. Because you, as a frail, fleshy, earthbound creature who's been around for 30, 40, 50 years, you're no match for these things. You're no match.
And that's kind of what we did with the Orange case. It was over our head.
Right. And that's a wise decision to reach out to get help from somebody. I personally, when I deal with the cases like the one I dealt with in Ashfield, as soon as I realized that we did have an actual demonic entity there, we disengaged. We only were there for maybe 2.5 hours. And the first thing I did was I sent an email to Keith. And I asked for Keith's help. And I had Keith go in and perform a blessing of the house. That is far beyond my capability of doing that safely for myself, for my fellow investigators, or for the client. So that's something to always bear in mind, and it served me well over the years. So that's rule number one. That's never go into an investigation in a compromised condition. And I think I talked about that briefly earlier on another case that I was discussing with you. If you're tired, or if you're sick, or if you've been under a lot of stress at work, or for some other reason you're under some form of duress where your thoughts are not focused, don't go. Any investigation. Because you're not going to do yourself any good by going. You're not going to do your fellow investigators any good by going, and you're certainly not going to do the client any good by going. This is opening you to attack as a potential victim, because if there is a demon or a bestial spirit that's present, they're going to sense that there's an opportunity there. It happens. It happened to me. So if you feel that way, my suggestion is sit it out. Catch the next one, because there'll be another one. There's plenty of them. But don't go on an investigation when you feel you're not up to it. You need your focus, you need your attention, and you need to be sharp when you go. Now, number 2 is for you. I will not allow provocation on any investigation I go on. Any form of provocation. It's not safe. The question you need to ask yourself is, what is it I'm provoking? And there's not a person in this room that can answer that question, including me. You don't know. You have no idea. Even if the signs of what's going on around you appear obvious, you still don't know. You have no idea. You don't pick a fight with something that you can't see. And that's
My stomach's talking about it.
I'll tell you, when you get that on one of those recorders, it's hard to, it's like,
There you go. Yeah, you're probably.
throw it out, there goes the stomach again.
Yeah,
Well, it's always good to stamp that on there.
I'm doing an investigation here.
Don't have the 3 burrito dinner before you go out and investigate.